Shadows in urban sketching is very important. It does make your sketch more believable and it comes to life. Let's go. The first thing to talk about is the direction of light source and the direction of the shadow. If you look at this photograph, you see that the direction of the shadow is on moving towards the right. In other words, the light is on the left. The source of the light is on the left. Why is that important? Well, it's important because when you use multiple references, specifically photograph, and you mix the light source, one photograph where the light source is from the left, one from the right, they will not work combined. You will have to think very carefully around where the source of light is from, and you have to use the same direction. In other words, if it's coming from the right, they have to be all coming from the right so that your shadows are consistent. So for example, if you want to sketch this zebra, the shadow is moving towards the right, and then you add another sort of giraffe where the shadow is moving to the left, it won't work because clearly those two have different light source. You will have to find a way to make the light source coming from the same angle before you start sketching and painting them. One way is to flip horizontally one of the photograph. Of course, you can have a multi-source light as well. Like in this case, there are 3 light sources with 3 shadows at the back. You could potentially sketch something like this with multiple light source, but I really would caution against this. For beginners especially, you should try to avoid a scenario like this because it's confusing to your audience unless you really has got a good handle on how to do your shadows already, and then I think that could be something you want to attempt. Another example is where you're doing food and you have a plate of food, and usually in a case like that, food on the table, you might have multiple light source. But other than that, try to avoid multi-light source, multi-shadows scenario because it is confusing. Another consideration that beginners should be thinking about is the moving sun. Sun moves, and in Singapore, for example, if you sit under the hot sun or you find a shadow and you sit underneath that and you start sketching and you take 1 hour or 2 hours to sketch, before long, if you have not managed your shadow well, you might get yourself burned. Why? Because the shadow might have moved away, the sun is going to hit you straight, and you have to move and shift where you are seated or stand, and then your perspective is different and your sketch is ruined. So think very carefully where the sun is moving so that you can actually manage to complete your sketch within the time before the sun hits you. The next point about shadow is the soft diffused shadow in the morning and the harsh sharp edges shadow in bright sunlight. Regardless, shadows will never be as sharp and edge as the actual object itself, but as you notice here, in the morning it is soft diffuse light, so the shadow will also be soft. And then of course at about 4 p.m. you see very sharp edges shadow when you are out there in harsh daylight. And why are all this information important? Well, if you're going to sketch them in urban sketching style, you're not going to have a lot of time to think. You need to know what light circumstances and what kind of harsh condition on your shadow and how you're going to reproduce them in real life. The next point I want to bring out is distance to shadow. So if you look at this tree and the long shadow that it casts on the ground, and by the end of where I'm standing, the shadow is a bit fuzzy and soft on the ground. And let me just put my camera casing and can see how sharp and solid the line or hard edge the edges are. It's so important to be able to see these things because when you sketch, you want to differentiate your shadow by the soft and hard edge that you make to represent whatever you see. But you must be able to see these things. Okay, now even an example like this, where I have a single light source, it doesn't move, you can see that the edges of the near shadow to the object is harder than the shadow further away. I'm not trying to make life complicated for you, but you must be able to see these things because these are the essence of observation, and before you can even translate it into sketches on a piece of paper. The next topic is about shadow colors. This is a topic that can be very hairy very quickly because it has to do with the ambient light, the actual color on the ground that the shadow is cast on, and then of course the object itself that is casting the shadow. And it can be very complicated, but I just suggest for beginners this simple idea that shadows ultimately should not be black, but it should be some kind of a grayish purple. And that's the simplest way you should attack it when you're starting on your urban sketching. One more thing, shadow should be considered as part of the shade or object of the shade. Let me illustrate this with shading this photograph for you. As you can see, I don't think of shadow as separate from the object itself. It is part of the shade, and shade is where your eyes see that it is part of the dark side, and the rest where it's not shaded is on the light side. Well, to make your life a little bit easy, I have 3 video examples. The first one is called the simple shadow trick, one of my best hit, and for obvious reasons because it deals with shadow. The second example is also quite similar, but it's more like indoor setting, and it's basically a chef. What I teach here is really to show you the example where the entire piece of shade is one piece, and then the lights are where the sunlight hits the chef and also the ingredients and the working table. And finally, the last example is a recent one. It's called a one simple shadow trick 2, where I show example of sketching a vintage car. Half of it is in shadow and half of it in the light. Again, you will see that I operate the same principle. The shadow and in the car as well as the backdrop is one piece. It's considered as one piece of shade. So with those examples, I hope I can give you a sense of how you will operate or rather sketch shadows in your urban sketching. It is so important because shadows is what gives form. As you know, form is the ingredient of urban sketching that create 3 dimension out of a 2-dimension piece of paper. And if you have not watched that video, here it is, the link to the ingredient of form, the secret to make your sketches come alive. So that's it for this week. I am done with this video. I hope you've got something out of the idea of creating shadows in all your urban sketching. Enough theory, I suppose. So get out and sketch some. But stay safe. This is Whee Teck, out.